And hello, Sachem. And thank you, Anne-Marie, for inviting me to do this talk. My name is Evan Weiner. I'm a journalist. I covered all sorts of sports from the 70s through now. And this is a topic that most people never think about, how presidents influence sports and how presidential policy towards sports impacted general society, like football. This guy here that you're looking at, Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt may have saved football in 1905. There was some pressure on Roosevelt to abolish the game. Why abolish the game? Well, 22 players that we know of died in 1904 from injuries suffered on the field. And in 1905, additional 18. Football was a real rough game. When they talked about the flying wedge, those players were flying. And they used to fling football players for first downs. Football had been around for a while. The first game, of course, allegedly played between Princeton and Rutgers back in 1869. It was a rough, tough game played by coal miners from Western Pennsylvania or Ohio. And it was getting rougher and rougher and rougher. And Roosevelt began to feel the pressure in 1905 from the president of Harvard, Charles Eliot. And Roosevelt and Eliot didn't like one another. So whatever Eliot liked, Roosevelt would not like. This time, Eliot's pushing for the abolishment of football because of all the injuries, all the maimings that were taking place. Roosevelt doesn't really want to abolish football. Of course, he couldn't abolish it anyway. They were going to play. But anyway, he's there. He's got the bully pulpit, and it's time to change the game or forsake it. Change the game or forsake it. Even Roosevelt said that. Roosevelt had a soft spot for some of the football players. In 1898, as the Secretary of Navy, Assistant Secretary of Navy, he was down in Puerto Rico during the Spanish-American War, led some people up San Juan Hill. Some of those people who he had among the people up the hill, former football players or football players by their occupation. His son, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., played football, was also maimed. Football was becoming more popular as the turn of the century continued into the 1904s and 05s. But eventually, the bully pulpit, Roosevelt gets three people or three contingents into the White House. The Harvard contingent, led by Charles Eliot, the president of Harvard. The Yale contingent, led by the football coach Walter Camp, legendary football coach, and the other from Princeton. And they bang their heads together literally and come up with rule changes along with an initiative that would eventually lead to the formation of the National Collegiate Athletic Association. Now, Roosevelt, did he save football? Probably not. Did he make it safer? Well, at least they thought they did by 1905 standards. This was the predominant thinking back in those days by people who didn't like football. You would see cartoons like that in the newspaper. If you notice, it's a skeleton. And if you notice the football is the size of a watermelon, not the kind of shape it is today. You could fling the ball backwards, lateral the ball, but you couldn't throw it forward. First down, you needed 5 yards, not 10 yards, which meant you could throw a player and almost land 5 yards. Football was wrapped in death. And that's what Roosevelt was talking about or being talked to about. Make the game safer. And they did. Some rule changes would come about. College football would continue to grow and grow and grow. Pro football also would continue to grow and grow. And by 1920, there was the formation of the National Football League. Did Roosevelt save the game? Yes. Did he make it safer? Well, evidence suggests probably not, with all of the CTE findings led by the Dr. Bennett Amalu, who I know, and he was the guy who discovered it. And a lot of players, their autopsies after they passed away revealed some fluid on the brain that has been identified to change their behavior, etc. It wouldn't be until 2014 before football would be discussed in terms of health in the White House. Theodore Roosevelt suffered injuries. I demand that football changes its rules, change the game, or forsake it. They changed the game. Football today is the most popular sport in the United States. So much so that even in this COVID virus, people are trying to figure out how they're going to watch National Football League games this fall, or college football, or even how you're going to stage it, particularly on college campuses, if college campuses are closed, because you really can't say, hey, let's play football with a closed campus with everybody learning online. So that's going to be kind of interesting this fall. The soft spot that Roosevelt had for football players, the guys going up the hill with him in 1898, San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War. When they listed their occupation as football players, and of course his son. College football would survive all the mass formations and gang tackling bans, some other changes, and college football would thrive in the decades to come. William Howard Taft really didn't have any real impact on sports, but he introduced two baseball traditions. One, the throwing out of the first pitch in Washington by a president, and the other, the seventh inning stretch. And both come out of the fact that women were demanding the vote. Back on April the 14th, 1910, William Howard Taft goes to a Washington Nationals baseball game because he's got a whole bunch of women in his office and they want the right to vote. And they are in Washington, the suffragettes there, they're meeting, there's a convention there, and they stop by the White House to have a chat with William Howard Taft. Things are not going well, they're bothering him. He tells an aide, hey, go, let's see this baseball game, let's see if we can get out. And he does. He's able to go to the baseball game with his staff because baseball would lift his spirits and the staff's spirits, and two things come out of it. That, the first pitch ever thrown to open the baseball season by a president. If you notice, there are a lot of women there. Women generally didn't go to baseball games in 1910. It was unladylike to attend the baseball game in 1910. That and the seventh inning stretch. The seats were 19 inches as opposed to 23 inches across today. This is a big man, a very big man. And he's squirming and he's moving around because he's uncomfortable sitting, and all of a sudden in between the top of the seventh and the bottom of the seventh inning, he stands up. Everybody in the crowd stands up thinking he's leaving, showing a sign of respect, but no, he's only stretching, and they stretch too. And that's the beginning of the seventh inning stretch, allegedly. Although there are many fathers to the seventh inning stretch. Many people claim they invented it in the 1890s. Taft might have seen it in Ohio back in the 1890s as well, because allegedly it was done there. But it was at this game that the seventh inning stretch really starts. Impact on society, baseball fans anyway, first pitch and stretching, probably in general society, not as much as Roosevelt. Taft, of course, a big man, more than 300 pounds, got cramped. Today, he might not have gotten cramped. The seats are bigger. Oh, a couple of years ago, in September of 2017, to be exact, I went up to Hyde Park with my wife, and we decided, or I decided, I needed to talk to Franklin Roosevelt about a few things. One, the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Two, the first president being on TV. The 1939 World's Fair, and also the Green Light Letter, which allowed baseball to play in 1942 after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The 1936 Olympics kind of interesting because there were a couple of people, Lee Janke and Jeremiah Mahoney, Judge Jeremiah Mahoney, who pushed for the United States Olympic team not to attend the Summer Olympics in Berlin because of the oppression that they were learning about taking place in Germany, and not to legitimize the Hitler regime. On December 8th, 1935, Mahoney gave a talk saying Americans needed to boycott the game. Janke sent a letter to the International Olympic Committee President Count André Ballet-Latour in November of 1935, floating the idea of the United States boycotting the games. Well, Franklin Roosevelt did not listen to them, even though Mahoney was going around the country with the New York governor, Al Smith, the governor of Massachusetts, James Curley, both Catholics, calling for a boycott of the 1936 Summer Olympics. But Roosevelt would have nothing of it. He urged the American team to go to Germany, even though he knew what was going on in Germany. I knew both of those guys. To the left is Marty Glickman. I worked with Marty Glickman at his broadcasting school in the 1980s. The other is Sam Stoller to the right. Sam ran the Milrose games. I knew both of them. Marty, the worst thing that ever happened to him was going to the Olympics. And I'll tell you the story in a second. He was going to Olympics. He didn't care about any bands because he's the fastest kid in Brooklyn. Fastest kid in Brooklyn. Outrun anybody. Sam was pretty fast as well. They made the 4x4 relay team, and Marty thought he was going to win the gold medal. He was going to get up on the podium, and he was going to show the Fuhrer just what he thought of the Fuhrer by having that gold medal in his hand. Marty and Sam never got a chance to run. They were pulled from the race. Marty said it was Avery Brundage who did it because he wanted to both Sam also was pulled from the race because Avery Brundage, who was the U.S. Olympic Committee president at the time, did not want to show up the Fuhrer with two Jews on the podium winning a gold medal. Roosevelt sat on his hands. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor is bombed. The commissioner of baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, sent Franklin Roosevelt a letter saying, what are we supposed to do? We curtailed the 1918 season because of World War I. What do you want us to do? Roosevelt sent a letter back to Landis, basically saying there will be fewer people unemployed. They'll be working even longer hours. They ought to have a chance for recreation. And they need to take their mind off their work more than ever before. With that letter, Major League Baseball played during World War II in 1942, 43, 44, 45, as did the National Hockey League. The touring basketball teams, the New York Rens, the Harlem Globetrotters, and the Midwest-based National Basketball League made up of industrial players, basically, all played along with the National Hockey League. There were golf tournaments, there were tennis tournaments. Everybody took that letter to say, hey, let's continue sports. That's what Roosevelt did in 1942. Dwight Eisenhower, like Ike, Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower had one impact on sports and the culture, which would impact the American way of life, because I was able to watch the Dancing Bears from the Moscow Circus, and some of you did too as well, because of Eisenhower, because of the cultural exchange. This is roughly 1957, 1958. The Cold War is simmering. Obviously, Eisenhower wanted to get something done to bring down the temperature on the Cold War, and he came up with, we'll send a hockey team, we'll send a track and field team to the USSR, they'll send cultural things, the Bolshoi Ballet, along with the Dancing Bears of the Moscow Circus, which I loved watching on Ed Sullivan. That was great when I was 6 and 7 years old. So he sends the hockey team to Moscow, and he sends both the national hockey team and then two NHL teams that didn't make the playoffs in '58, the NHL's New York Rangers and the Boston Bruins. But this guy here, Bill Cleary, who was on the national team in 1956, and I'm at Rockefeller Center in 1995, and there's a celebration, the 35th anniversary of the U.S. winning the gold medal in Lake Tahoe over the Czechs, and the 1980 Olympic hockey team with the victory over Finland, both for gold medals. And Bill Cleary was there, and he said to me, hey, did you ever hear the story about us in Moscow? I said, I never knew you went to Moscow. And he said, well, it was an Eisenhower initiative. And he said, we go to Moscow, and we're there as ambassadors. And we fly into Moscow, and we get taken to a hotel, and then we get taken to dinner. And it's a state dinner, middle of the hotel, and everything is laid out for a state dinner. And they look into their plates, and they see this little thing, a model, a replica of Sputnik. Sputnik had been blasted off and was the first artificial satellite into space. The Americans couldn't do it, and the Soviets decided to rub it in their face that that thing there went into space. I've given this talk this talk and a lunar talk, thanks to my friend Dick Hull, a couple different places. And one guy said to me about Sputnik, he said, I didn't worry about Sputnik going up. I worried about how it was launched, an ICBM landing in New York. As far as Cleary went, he said they kind of all laughed at it, but they knew that they were being intimidated. Did it bring down the temperature? No, it didn't. The Cold War continued, and then it got into a space race. But Dwight Eisenhower attempted to open up something by sports. Keep in mind, Dwight Eisenhower's vice president was Richard Nixon. John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy put his signature to something that caused football widows on Sundays in the 1960s and propelled the National Football League into a different stratosphere totally. It was Kennedy that signed the Broadcast Act of 1961 into law, although he wasn't the one who crafted it. It was crafted by a veteran congressman from Brooklyn, New York, whom some of you might know, Emanuel Seller, who might have entered Congress during the War of 1812. What the Sports Broadcast Act of 1961 did was simple. All teams in the National Football League, and this is basically National Football League, all 14 teams could be pulled together as once and sell the one entity to either CBS or NBC at the time, Paley CBS and Sarnoff over at NBC, without violating antitrust laws. What the NFL wanted was what the AFL, American Football League, was doing under the table with ABC, which really wasn't a full network in 1960, which allowed all 8 of its teams to be bunched as one, sold to ABC to get X amount of dollars. That's what Pete Rozelle wanted for the NFL, where New York and Green Bay would get the same amount of television money and equal it all out. The legwork done by Emanuel Seller, the Seller bill, allowed the NFL to skirt antitrust laws, and there's Emanuel Seller. What it did was give the NFL money, make every team equal on any given Sunday. Anybody could win, and it changes the NFL. By 1965, with the National Football League and the American Football League, football and college football surpasses baseball as the number one sport in America, according to the Harris polling. The act would apply to the National Hockey League, National Basketball Associations, and other leagues. This guy here, he was a racist. It's George Preston Marshall, and George Preston Marshall wanted a new stadium in Washington, D.C., for his Washington football team. But the Kennedy administration would step in. Marshall did not hire any Negro players for his team. In fact, Shirley Povich, Maury Povich's father, who was the sports editor of the Washington Post, once wrote a column and then asked Marshall, when are you going to have a Negro player on the team? And Marshall said, hey, I'll have a Negro player on the team as soon as the Harlem Globetrotters hire a white guy. Well, there was a lot of pressure on Marshall to desegregate. Finally, the Kennedy administration stepped in through Stuart Udall, who was the Secretary of the Interior, and they told Marshall, listen, you want a lease for the new D.C. stadium, which is built with federal money? You have to hire a Negro player, or you're going to stay in Old Griffith Stadium. The stadium was built in 1962. There is JFK and Udall. They put pressure on Udall. Put pressure on Marshall, rather. And Udall says to Marshall, hey, listen, you want the new stadium, hire a Negro player or play somewhere else. Marshall didn't want to leave the Washington metropolitan area, had no choice in the Washington area, and finally submitted and succumbed to JFK's pressure and drafted this guy, Ernie Davis, from Syracuse University, traded him for Bobby Mitchell, guy who I knew, great guy. And if there was any function in Washington from about 1962 to into the 2000s, Bobby Mitchell was there. Mr. Washington football. Unfortunately, he had leukemia and he passed away. He was traded to Cleveland for Bobby Mitchell. Passed away, never played with the Cleveland Browns. But Marshall got his 30-year lease thanks to the pressure put upon him by Udall and John F. Kennedy. The Boston Celtics did visit the White House to see John F. Kennedy. This was the middle of the civil rights era. And Kennedy, who actually was from Bronxville, New York. He spent most of his time growing up in Bronxville, New York, not Boston, because Joe Kennedy moved here. But anyway, he gets a presidential visit, the first presidential visit in a long, long time. Lyndon Johnson signed the legislation that allowed the Super Bowl to be played. The bill would be signed on November 8th, 1966. Much of the legwork for the bill came from two senators, Russell Long, who was the fifth most powerful Democrat in the Senate in 1966 from Louisiana, and the Democrats had control of the Senate, along with Cokie Roberts' father, a powerful Louisiana congressman by the name of Hale Boggs. Now, there's a little background to this thing. I usually give this in two talks, one a Super Bowl talk, one athletes in protest. The Super Bowl created in part by the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which Johnson signed. The roots go back to a New Orleans All-Star game, the American Football League. Supposed to play there, never did, because African-American players boycotted the game because they couldn't get taxis to hotels. They were intimidated going into bars. One player, Ernie Ladd, was told to leave by the bouncer. He wouldn't. The bouncer took out a gun. They were called names. They weren't getting services, so they decided to boycott the game. This is early 1965. 1966, June 6, 1966, rather June 8th, the NFL and the AFL merged. Pete Rozelle, the commissioner, has to bring it through Congress. He encounters two roadblocks in Russell Long and also Hale Boggs. And basically, they have to trade for a franchise. It's Cookie Gilchrist who led the way in the boycott. New Orleans would become a political football. And eventually, a deal would be cut between the National Football League and Hale Boggs and Russell Long. Pete Rozelle, seen there, and there's me behind Pete Rozelle. That was 1986, Foley Square, Southern District of New York Courthouse, USFL NFL trial. I had just finished doing an interview with Rozelle, which is why I was smiling, because I was walking away as he was walking away. And Rozelle has to sell the deal, and he comes up with a deal. I'll trade you a New Orleans franchise in exchange for you allowing the merger. That happened. Even though Pete Rozelle initially was skeptical about that happening, all the maneuvers take place, and eventually it leads to this, the Super Bowl, January 15th, 1967, the Los Angeles Coliseum, the Kansas City Chiefs, the team in white, Green Bay Packers, the team in green, and that's Los Angeles Coliseum, January 15th, 1967. Lyndon Johnson's pen is enshrined in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He signs the legislation November 8th, 1966, that creates the Super Bowl. The pen is in the Hall of Fame. It's not known that it's the Super Bowl at that time. That would come in 1969. The stadium in Los Angeles was 1/3 empty. 66,000 people did see the game. Oh, I knew Richard Nixon. If I had more time, I would tell you all about Richard Nixon and the years I covered him, which was 1985 to 1988. Nixon would come back into prominence by being the arbitrator that settled the Major League Baseball umpires dispute with the owners after the 1984 season. Nixon and ping pong diplomacy. Nixon, as part of his 1968 platform, wanted to go to China, but he didn't have any openings to go to China. He would eventually get the opening. In 1971, a ragtag United States table tennis team ends up in the Yoga, Japan, to play in the World Championships, and they would play against the Chinese team. They were terrible. The Chinese team, Red China in those days, or Communist China, had the best team in the world. A 19-year-old named Glenn Cowan, self-described hippie, although hippies were gone by 1967. There was actually a funeral in Haight-Ashbury. Getting rid of it. Anyway, he hops on the Chinese team's national bus and there's quiet, and then all of a sudden the quiet is broken, and there's an interpreter on the bus, and he shakes hands with people on the Chinese team, and Mao Zedong is impressed by all of this. Eventually, one member of the Chinese team would get a T-shirt with the Beatles lyric on there, or the McCartney lyric, "Let It Be" on there. And that would open up China. Mao Zedong was totally impressed. And he invites the team to China, and Nixon, he's impressed too, because he was surprised. I never expected that the China Initiative would come to fruition in the form of a ping pong team. April 14th, 1971, Zhou Enlai, who is the Chinese prime minister, meets with Henry Kissinger. Travel bans are gone, trade embargoes are gone, back-channel communications are open between the two countries. Remember, Dwight Eisenhower tried this with the Soviet Union, really didn't get that far with that, but Richard Nixon would succeed to the point where eventually Nixon would end up in China. Meanwhile, that's Edith Green. Edith Green was an Oregon congresswoman, Democrat from the 4th District, who entered Congress in 1955, known as the Mother of Education. And she and Patsy Mink from Hawaii in the House, Birch Bayh in the Senate, all ushered in this thing called Title IX, the Title IX legislation, which allowed women to get equal opportunity in all educational forums in upper education, as long as the college or university accepted federal money. Nixon signs that into law on June 23rd, 1972. And oddly enough, when he signs it into law, it doesn't say very much about it, but there is Title IX. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits, or subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. With that, Nixon opens up the door to women's sports exploding in the United States. The battle of Title IX has continued for a very long time through 2007. Things seem to be very quiet on that front, revoking Title IX. Richard Nixon didn't have very much to do with the Munich 11. That was the 9 Israeli athletes and 2 coaches that were killed during the Munich Massacre during the 1972 Munich Olympics. The massacre was the first time you ever saw terrorism in your living room. Jim McKay did a great job for ABC. Shout out to somebody in my business for 14 hours describing the events. Howard Cosell was there too. Wouldn't be anything without Howard, right? The massacre, of course, the Germans botched that up, and the 11 Israelis were killed. Nixon sends a letter to Avery Brundage, of whom Howard Cosell once said, he became of age during the time of William of Orange. And I sent a picture of a bar called William of Orange. I was in Delft in Holland to Cosell's grandkids, and they thought it was great. Nixon, in a telegram to Avery Brundage, demanded that the games be called off. Brundage instead, 27 words of encouragement to our Israeli friends, said the games must go on. The games must go on. There's Avery Brundage. Nixon wanted to watch a football game on TV in December of 1972, and that changed how people watch football in the United States. Think of this. The most powerful man in the world cannot watch a Washington playoff football game in a stadium about 4 miles from the White House because of the NFL's TV blackout. So he decides to do something about it because, wait, let's put it this way. Nixon was your average guy who wanted to watch football. There was his friend. There's Nixon. To his left is George Allen, and in between, there's a player, and there's Marv Levy, the only Harvard University graduate who ever was a head coach of a National Football League team, the Buffalo Bills. I love Marv. I could go on and on about Marv, who's very literate, the over-officious jerk over there. Anyway, Nixon wants to watch football. So on December 18th, 1972, at 2:06 in the afternoon, he calls his Attorney General, Richard Kleindienst. I want to watch football. Game sold out, but he's unable to watch football. But in 1973, because Nixon couldn't watch the Washington Green Bay Packers postseason game at a sold-out RFK Stadium, football rules are changed. Compromise is reached between the government and the NFL. And if a game was sold out prior to 72 hours of the kickoff, starting in 1973, it would be shown in the home market. And the league adopted that so games could be shown without being blacked out in the home market, like Nixon couldn't see the game in 1972. Jimmy Carter. Now, this is all about the Soviet boycott, or rather the U.S. boycott of the Soviet Olympics. In 1980, Jimmy Carter gave the Soviet Union an ultimatum: get out of Afghanistan. This is in January of 1980. Or we're going to boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics. On March 21st, Carter boycotted the Soviet Olympics. He was joined with 60 other leaders of countries in the boycott. The United States Olympic hockey team won the Olympic gold medal in that time, February of 1980, up at Lake Placid. They did not win the game, or the medal rather. In the game, they beat the Soviet Union on Friday. That only gave them the opportunity to play in the final game, which they won by beating Finland, but nobody remembers that today. The Miracle on Ice is all about this game. The Soviets, professionals against the college kids, and for that one day, the American college kids prevailed. At Lake Placid that day, the USA chant was heard for the first time. There was an embargo that included grain and informational technology that Carter issued. He also restricted Soviet fishing in American-controlled waters. The Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan in 1989. 40 years later, it's safe to say the boycott was an ultimate failure. Ronald Reagan did two things, and you probably don't equate these two things with Ronald Reagan. You watch a lot of cable, on cable TV, you watch a lot of sports, and there are a lot of new stadiums that have been built. In 1984, Reagan signed the Cable Television Act into law, and what that did was socialize cable TV, because you had a choice. You had basic cable or you had an extended tier. And if you wanted the extended tier, you had to pay for everything on that tier or you got nothing. It's like the Frank Sinatra song, all or nothing at all. Sports owners realized you could make a lot of money by getting your product on the basic expanded tier. Here in the New York area, you have SNY, you have the Yankees Yes Network, you have Fox, you have Madison Square Garden, you have ESPN, you have a whole bunch of things. The Garden was on cable TV prior to 1984, as was Sports Channel, but that was picked up by the cable, not part of the basic agreement necessarily. But sports owners figured out, hey, let's start networks, or let's get involved with networks. We can make a lot of money off sports. All sports migrated from over-the-air TV, particularly baseball, with the exception of National Football League, onto that tier because there was money to be made thanks to Ronald Reagan. He bought all or nothing at all. And actually, the legislation saved ESPN, CNN, and the Weather Channel from financial ruin and extended their lives. That's the new baseball park. It's not new anymore. It was built 20 years ago in Cincinnati. And what Reagan did with Dick Gephardt, who is a Democrat in the House, and others, was put together this Tax Reform Act. Gephardt was a Democrat, of 1986, and created a huge loophole for municipalities to build things for municipalities like parks or fountains. But it also was a huge, huge gain for owners because all of a sudden they had the ammunition in their quest to get new stadiums. And under the right set of circumstances, municipality could put up 92 cents out of every dollar to pay down the debt of a baseball park like this in Cincinnati. And you can't raise from the 8 cents out of every dollar enough to pay down the debt. So in Cincinnati, what they did, among other things, raise sales taxes, sell off a municipal hospital at 50 cents in the dollar, lay off workers, a whole bunch of things to end up paying for that stadium and a football stadium. And that repeated in city after city after city after city after city. And that's because of Ronald Reagan. 92 cents out of every dollar generated by the public in the publicly funded stadium could go to an owner. And in a lot of cases did. I spoke at the George W. Bush Museum. And that was in 2007, a White House job. Well, actually, it was a State Department job. Your taxpayers at work right there. Condoleezza Rice approved me being there. Richard Gates approved me being there. He was the head of Texas A&M at the time. And so I gave a talk about the politics of sports and business to a bunch of non-Americans from Venezuela, from Canada, from Nigeria, from Russia at the time, from Indonesia, and Venezuela, and 4 Americans. And you can tell it's old because look at my flip phone. George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush, president, in 1990 signed the Steroids Act into law. Steroid possession was made illegal without a doctor's approval. It was something that was flaunted by athletes in the 1990s into the 21st century. But very few people ended up in jail. Very few people ended up in jail. And if they did, they caught them online, not because of illegal drugs or legal substances possession. Bill Clinton tried to solve the baseball strike in 1994-95. What I need to do, and I didn't do in this presentation, so I got to put up a picture of me and Don Fear, who's the executive director of the Baseball Players Association back then, and him walking out of a courthouse after a judge, Sonia Sotomayor, now Supreme Court Justice, ruled play ball that the owners negotiated in bad faith during the collective bargaining negotiations in 1994-95, which forced the players to go on strike. Clinton failed miserably. Most people would have failed miserably, even if you had the patience of the saint dealing with the owners like Richard Ravitch, their negotiator, and the Players Association. Eventually, it would be settled in court. He did sign the Curt Flood Act of 1998, which allowed players the same labor rights as those of basketball, football, hockey, and soccer. The antitrust legislation, or actually the antitrust exemption that baseball got from the Supreme Court in 1922, has been really watered down to only territorial rights. That if you have a territorial right, you could share it with like the Mets and Yankees, Giants and A's, Dodgers or Angels, Washington and Baltimore, or you could stop anybody else from going into your market. So the players have a bit more freedom because of Bill Clinton. George W. Bush, the former owner of the Texas Rangers Major League Baseball team. 2004, his State of the Union address, and it addressed steroid usage in sports. By 2005, Congress was looking into the use of steroids in sports, and that would change drug testing rules, and particularly in baseball, but all the other sports, or collective bargaining. The Bush administration also provided a good deal of the security and money for the Athens Olympics for security as part of the war on terrorism. Barack Obama, 2 things about Barack Obama. He failed to get the Olympics in 2016 in Chicago, and he had a White House summit on concussions in football. 2009, Obama did go to Copenhagen to genuflect in front of the International Olympic Committee. He flies to Chicago. He says a very effective committee had flown to Copenhagen to make their presentation. Michelle had gone with them. He gets a call. He flies out there. He finds out that the International Olympic Committee's decisions may be a little cooked. I could have told him that. In fact, both the International Olympic Committee and FIFA, the head of the governing body of soccer, are fighting allegations in various courts about being corrupt. We didn't even make the first cut, despite the fact by all objective metrics, the American bid was the best. They were going to go that year to Brazil, partly because of the BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China countries who were thought to have hot economies at the time. it was a bad move in terms of Rio bidding for the Olympics because too much happened. They lost too much money. People went to jail. In 2014, Obama addressed the concussion issue again. Didn't realize that Teddy Roosevelt did the same thing 109 years earlier. It's at this conference where Obama said, if I had boys, I doubt that I would have allowed them to play football because of brain injuries. The concussion issue was hot for a while. It's faded into the background. Nobody talks about it anymore. The movie with Will Smith, Concussion, disappeared. Everything has disappeared. Football is back. At least their TV ratings last year, the NFL, up. Who knows what's going to happen this year with COVID-19, but had no impact, the concussions, as people have come back. And Donald Trump has had his signature, or in his case, his thoughts impacting some sports. Pledged support for the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics. LA got it. Pledged support for the 2026 Soccer World Cup. That's a joint bid by the United States, Canada, and Mexico. They got that, and he pardoned the fighter from the 19 teens, Jack Johnson, who was stripped of his title because of the Mann Act, signed into law by William Howard Taft, where you cannot take women over state lines for immoral purposes. Jack was arrested, ended up in jail, went to Europe, became a promoter, made a lot of money in his career, not necessarily from boxing. He was finally pardoned by Donald Trump. Two other people who you might know that got ensnared with the Mann Act, Charlie Chaplin and Chuck Berry, spent a couple years in jail. So presidents do matter when it comes to sports. And started with Andrew Johnson, actually, in 1865. He brought members of the Brooklyn and Washington baseball teams to the White House because he thought after the Civil War, showing him with baseball players would help heal the country. Again, thank you, Sachem. Thank you, Anne-Marie. And hope to see you live one day with another talk. I only have about 30 of them to go. Anyway, thank you so much, Anne-Marie. Thank you for watching. Until the next time, I'm Evan Weiner. Thank you so much for watching.